Good morning and welcome to ACT Chess Association broadcast of the ACTCA Rapid events, which are currently running online on Wednesday evenings on chess.com. My name is Sean Press. I organise these events on behalf of the ACT Chess Association, and we're covering obviously the event that took place last night, 23rd of September. It was a 4-round event. Normally it's 5, but when the starters gun went off, there were only 8 players ready to go under the chess.com rules. You can't have more rounds than half the size of the field. Of course, a couple of players then entered late, which has happened a couple of times now, which can be a bit irritating because if they'd entered on time, we'd have had 10 players and we'd have had 5 rounds. In the end, the tournament was won by Miles Patterson with 3 out of 4, which is a fairly low score. And this was reflected in the massive tie for second, well, not massive tie, but a 4-way tie for second on 2.5 points between Kevin Liu, Hui Li, Stephen Mugford, and Glenn Ingham, who all scored 2.5 out of 4. And the game I'm looking at is an interesting one, and it was played between the winner, Miles Patterson, and second place Kevin Liu, but it was a win for Kevin, so it was a win for the second place player rather than the winner of the tournament. And the reason I've chose it was a really well played game by both sides, just a couple of slips here and there before Black went on to win, and I'm showing it from Black's point of view, by the way, just because it was a win for Black. So here we go. Let's get into the game as quickly as we can. Miles, of course, started with c4, as he always does. Symmetrical English, I don't know a hell of a lot about. I have looked at it in the past. So we get our 4 knights, symmetrical English 4 knights, g3, g6 here. And Miles went with d4 to get some play in the center as soon as possible. You can maintain symmetry for a while with these sort of moves, but you generally will play d4 at some point. And then after takes and takes, queen b6, e3 is an example line, and this position's still pretty equal. Both sides are just developing their pieces as they wish. I would have slight concerns about the dark square bishop on c1, but normally white will play something like b3 and then bishop b2 in this position. So d4 was played, and there was a swap of pawns in the center, and d6. And again, we can keep with the idea of fianchettoing both bishops on g2 and g7 and maintain the policy of trying to put pressure on these 4 central squares here in the middle. But Miles decided to go for a bit of pawn structure damage with knight takes c6 and b takes c6. Interestingly enough, as much as this looks like a reasonably good plan and probably is, it's not as great for white as you would sometimes think. And in fact, I think there was, if I remember correctly, a little bit of anti-computer strategy way back in the late 70s, early 80s, when there was a human-computer match between Levy and, I think, Chess 4 point whatever, where David Levy realised that the computer loved playing knight takes c6, pawn takes c6, and then he just used the open b file for counterplay. So bishop g2 now, hitting the pawn, bishop d7, castles. Now there's an interesting idea for white here to try and break up black's center with c5. Okay, at first it looks like you can take, which sure you can, but now the pawn on c5 actually isn't easily defended, and you just simply castle, bishop g7, then you play knight a4, and you're threatening to win the pawn back. And black normally castles and just returns the pawn, and then but after the knight takes on c5, it's a nice square. You're hitting d7, so you are threatening to swap a few times and then take the c6 pawn, which becomes a weakness. So white just gets a little bit of aggressive play there. Coming back to this position after knight a4, if black decides to try and hang on to it with queen a5, then queen c2 just maintains the threat there. And white is going to win the pawn back, and black has got a bit of a wrecked pawn structure. Black can avoid that, and I'll show you in the next line. So castles, bishop g7, and bishop d2. And again, c5 can be tried here. The other line that I didn't look at up top, because I'm looking at it now, is you don't take and you play d5. But then white continues the strategy of trying to open the pawn. basically destroy black's pawn center. E4 after d takes, knight takes, for example, bishop takes, castles. It is equal. This is a better way of playing it for black, most definitely. But black now has some pressure on the b pawn, as I said, with the open b file, and in this case the bishop on g7 ganging up down here on b2. The rook will come to b1. But at the same time, white's got some more space. The c pawn is a little bit weak here. Still needs to be guarded by the bishop on d7 or another piece because of the bishop on e4 attacking it down the diagonal. White had played bishop d2 here. Bishop g5 I think is worth considering as well. Rook b8 and then just queen d2 here. But the bishop went to d2, which is a little bit slow. I think the bishop's probably not the best placed piece on that square. And queen goes to c8 with the idea of playing bishop h3 and then swapping off the light square bishop and reducing the pressure on the c6 pawn. After rook e1, which turns out to be an almost necessary move against the bishop h3 threat. This does give white the opportunity to move the bishop to f3. If the rook was still on f1, then of course moving the bishop loses the rook to the bishop. So bishop f3 is not a bad idea here. Bishop takes h3, normally I wouldn't recommend this, and you probably don't play a move like this because you are surrendering all the white squares around your king. But it can be played just in this situation. So queen takes h3 with the idea of playing knight g4. White starts to counterattack with queen a4, looking to take on c6 with the threat to the king and the rook. And you can either retreat back to d7, and then after rook a d1, white's perfectly okay here because the queen isn't really causing too much problems for the white king. King d7, if you really want to try and get knight g4 in, you defend it with the king. But after f3, that's not quite happening. And black can try for the all-out attack with h5, but white, I think, has more than enough defensive chances, especially with a move like c5, trying to open up the position, because the king on d7 really doesn't want the d file open because of the rooks swinging across. So sometimes in positions like this, it's always worth looking at some dynamic play. If you're not comfortable with playing dynamic chess like that, one suggestion is look at games by players who do play dynamic chess like that, so that you can become more confident that these ideas do in fact work. So castles. Instead, after rook e1, rook b1, because of the pressure with the b file, and the bishop on g7 hitting all the way down the diagonal. And at the same time, white's going to try and expand on the queen side with b4. So bishop now goes to h3. And the bishop dropped back to h1. Probably f3 was better because it does keep an eye on the g4 square. Black can play knight g4 here. It looks a little bit, I wouldn't say pointlessly aggressive, but there are two reasons why knight g4 actually is a nice move. One, f2 could be a problem after the queen goes to f5, and also the knight can reposition itself back to e5, hitting the pawn on c4, and also looking at some squares around the king there. Queen d7 was a bit of a surprise move. Not quite sure. I mean, it is bringing the rooks into the game a little bit. b3 instead of b4 in this case. d5, fighting back in the centre is not a bad idea right now. And that's probably why queen went to d7 as well, to support the pawn. If you play knight takes d5, the c6 pawn is isolated on an open file. So recapturing and fixing your pawn structure is almost always to be recommended, unless there's some absolutely dynamic reason why you shouldn't do it. So c takes is much better. And then bishop e3. So I'm still not convinced that the dark squared bishop is really a friend for white, because it always seems to just end up on slightly wrong squares as it went. If you wanted to play the kind of swap everything offline, you could play bishop f4. And then after the rook comes here to d8, rook c1, d4. And then after knight a4, knight d5. And black is getting slightly on top here. There's a couple of threats in this position. The knight's well placed. We are just simply threatening to capture on f4, play queen g5, and suddenly white's getting mated. So swapping might be the best move, but after queen takes e4 to try and drive the queen away, you get this little surprise move in first. So you get d takes e3, queen takes d5, e takes f2, king takes f2, rook takes d5, and rook takes e7. And white is slightly worse, not completely worse in this position, but slightly worse in this position. And there's a few good moves for black here. Rook f5 is probably the main one that white has to think about initially because of the threat of g4 after pinning, g5 after pinning the bishop against the king. But that's a different line, and you end up almost certainly with a different game if you play this line. So the bishop went to e3, e6 here, bishop to d4, and we bring the rook into the center. And then about now, white went wrong here. Rook c1 was the right move in this position, almost certainly. And you'll see why in a second, because after queen c1, bishop f5 suddenly hits the rook, okay, and forcing the rook back into the corner. Because if you play something like e4, d takes e4, bishop takes f6, bishop takes f6, knight takes e4. Black gets a nice advantage after bishop takes here, rook ac8 to hit the queen, queen heads to a3 for example, and then you just play queen d2, and suddenly black's pieces are much more active than white's. As much as opposite coloured bishops can be drawish, in the middle game, the bishop on f6 is looking to play moves like bishop to d4, and the bishop on e4 can't oppose it. And the theory is that in the middle game with opposite coloured bishops, essentially you're playing with one more attacking piece because your opponent can't fight against it with a similar piece. So the rook went to a1 and then rook ac8, queen to b2 to break the pin, and then e5 is an excellent move here. And now white is in serious trouble, and all because of that bishop on d4. So if the bishop goes back to e3, of course d4 just forks two pieces and wins material. So the bishop takes on e5. And then d4 was played here. And by the way, the finish for black is really good at this point. Just keeps up the threats, keeps hammering away at white's position and attacking loose pieces. So the knight went back to d1. If it went to a4, I'll give you just an example of how the position can really fall apart quickly. Rook c2. Hitting the queen, and the queen goes to a3, and then bishop f8 is a really nice move here because the queen really has nowhere to go, so you block with b4. The queen e7 hits both the bishop and the pawn on b4 if you want. Bishop takes f6, queen takes f6, knight c5. d3 is an excellent move. Because basically what you want to do is either push the pawn all the way to the end of the board, or if white takes like this, swap on c5 first, b takes c5, bishop h3, and suddenly you're threatening queen takes f2 mate. And if you play rook f1 to stop that, rook takes f2 is great, because after rook takes f2, the house just falls in with queen takes a1. A long forcing line, but in most cases it's just simple captures and recaptures. I was explaining to one of my students during the week that we always say look at checks, look at captures, and study forcing lines because it makes thinking a little bit quicker and easier and finding solutions to problems. What generally happens, though, I find, is that you normally have to look at a lot of forcing moves when it's your move, and a lot of single force and a lot of forcing replies when you choose a move just to check whether it's not a complete blunder. But once you've gone through the process of choosing a forcing move for yourself and your opponent, the rest of the line often falls out very quickly in terms of you just have to keep making threats and captures, and you're probably 4 or 5 moves deep already. So a long line like that is hard to spot at the start, but I tend to think is easier to calculate by the end, if that makes sense. So knight d1. Retreats and protects f2 if that becomes a problem. And then queen e6 was another really good move here. It's hitting the bishop. The temptation would be to play rook c2, and this is certainly a good move because that's, in a sense, that's what black has done by pushing in the center, has taken control of the second rank. Queen a3, of course, and then I think black is easily better here. But queen e6 was a better move, and we'll see why in a bit. So after the bishop goes back, then we play rook c2, hitting the queen, and after queen a3, rook takes on e2. So that's why the queen's sitting on e6, because it's supporting the rook. So rook takes e2, queen takes e2, and white is in serious trouble here. I'm not sure white knew how much trouble they were in, but they're in pretty big trouble at this point. Queen to b2, offering the swap, but then the queen just checks. Okay, and the king goes to g2, and we follow up with another check. And this is back again about forcing moves. We're just finding our solution very quickly, basically just playing tactics. King to h3 gets run rook d5, and the threat is to play rook to h5 with mate. So pawn to f3, and then a nice little capture here. Bishop takes f3, king takes f3, queen e4 to force the king back. You could take on h1 straight away, but then the queen might come across and block. So this way, when you now take on h1, the queen can't come to g2 to protect. So the queen went to e2, pawn goes up to d3, and basically at this point the game ended abruptly. But I'll just go queen f3, for example. Knight e4 is a nice move because the king has no squares to move to, and the queen has to give itself up, which is winning for black, of course. White played queen to d2 instead, and then the snap mate knight g4 landed on the board here. And the king, has no squares, and it's checkmate. So that was a really, really good win for black, who, by the way, is just a junior player from Sydney who's joined our tournaments. I believe he's been coached by Ian Rogers, which certainly shows in that game there. So no shame in losing a game like that to such a talented young player. But having said that, Miles Patterson, who was white in this game, then went on to win the tournament with 3 out of 4. Kevin bizarrely in the next game was easily a piece up against Glen Ingham, but agreed to a draw. I don't quite know what the circumstances, and then fell apart in the last game against Wei Lee, dropped a piece in the opening, which was unfortunate. So he started off with 2 strong games, drew his third, and then fell apart in his fourth. But that was from last night's ACTCA Chess Association Rapid Play event. It's the only online event at the moment being organised by the ACT Chess Association. It is at 7 o'clock Wednesday nights on chess.com. You need to find the ACT Chess Association Chess Club to apply to join. We generally only take people from ACT or connected with ACT Chess. We have expanded that slightly because a lot of other state associations really aren't doing what we're doing, and I do feel sorry for players whose state associations haven't quite got their act together. It's not a challenge to organise events like this. The other piece of good news, and I'm not sure I mentioned it last week, is the 2020 Vikings Weekender looks like it's a goer. It's going to be at the Lanyon Club in Condor in southern Canberra on the weekend of the 21st and 22nd of November. There will be some restrictions in terms of social distancing, of course. We are limited to a maximum of 100 players, but that event has never attracted 100 players, so we should be good for that one. The only other restriction in terms of interstate entries is if the ACT government is giving travel advice about not travelling to certain areas, then we're not going to take entries from those same areas, of course. If ACT people aren't travelling to areas in Sydney, then we're not going to be able to take entries from people from those same areas, if that makes sense. That rules out Victoria for the moment, by the way. And they've just changed the regulations about Sydney, and they've listed a number of hotspots in Sydney where people can't travel from. At the moment, we're still going Greater Sydney is out of bounds, but that may change in the next couple of weeks. So that's good news for Over the Board Chess, that the Vikings Weekender is taking place in late November. So thanks for tuning in. As I said, my name is Sean Press. I organise these events on behalf of the ACT Chess Association. I do the summaries the day after. So Thursdays at the moment, around about 10 o'clock is when I do my summaries in the morning. So thanks for tuning in. And until next Thursday, I'll be seeing you later.